Welcome everyone. I'm Brett Dunstone, and today we've got our latest Zero Carbon Mine webinar where we've got a panel discussion with a few experts in the field where we're talking about sort of beyond the technology, what's holding back mining decarbonisation. So I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves, and then I suppose quick point on like what they feel that people in mining need to know more. What's one thing about mining decarbonisation that wish that people understood better, so we could get things moving a bit faster. So I suppose start with yourself, Ed.
Brilliant, thanks, Brett. So yeah, hi everyone. Ed Fagan. I'm with Zero Nexus. We're a small engineering consulting and research group out of Ontario, Canada. I suppose to answer your question, one thing that I wish kind of more people understood about the decarbonisation process, I guess, is really to see it as a continuous process, and that it's not any one single change or technology that's going to get you there. Our group most recently wrapped up a research project on looking at brownfield electrification using battery electric vehicles in underground mines across Canada, and it was a real learning experience going out, talking to the teams that are kind of going through that ongoing development, learning, adaptation process. And the teams that I think are most successful doing it are the ones that treat it as a process, and kind of go in with the expectation that not everything's going to be done right the first time, that there's learning to be had, especially with newer technologies.
Right. And Steph?
Yeah, I'm Steph Byrom. I'm a general manager at Loop Decarb. Loop is a joint venture between a few firms. So Talisman Tech is an advisory firm. Mitchell Services are an ASX listed drilling firm, and also Sumitomo, a large Japanese conglomerate. So our focus is operationalizing decarb processes. At the moment, we're focused on reducing emissions in fugitive gas in the open cut coal space. I think the one thing I would probably say, like, that people, I wish that they knew kind of before they embarked on this thing is, like, I totally agree with Ed, it is a process. I think there's a lot more to do on the other side of, like, you need to get some buy-in from people, right? If you want to make these changes, there is a huge cultural shift, and don't forget about, like, it's not all about tech. You've got to remember about the people. So people make mines work, and one of the biggest things is that you got to get people on board and people kind of understanding the journey. Because yeah, it's a process that you want people on site to actually own.
Mick?
Thank you. Good morning and good evening. My name's Mick Brown. I'm a senior manager at Palaris, a mining advisory firm with I suppose, a global and a strong Australian presence. I primarily work in the decarbonisation space, but also support investment-focused technical reviews and other mining studies. My background is mining engineering, mine studies and investment evaluation, and a little sabbatical of sorts in resources policy and investment policy for government. I've been in the mines decarb space for 5 years now, and previously was the manager for mines decarbonisation for a large mining company, looking after a team of 30 across electrification focused studies and on the ground trials of new technologies. In terms of if there's one thing I could snap my finger and have people understand about mines decarbonisation, it really is an opportunity, and I suppose I'd like to flip that narrative where even the theme today are what are the barriers, but really what's the opportunity. And we're seeing a lot of the mining companies globally targeting the minerals required for the energy transition and decarbonisation more generally. And really, we have to lead from a mining perspective in terms of decarbonising our operations in order to, I suppose, complement what our minerals are being used for in terms of the global energy transition. So yeah, that's probably my one thing is the narrative is it's an opportunity.
All right. No, thanks, Mick. And Deborah, finish with yourself.
Great, thanks. I appreciate you including me, Brett. I'm Debra Johnson, and I am a senior strategist with Stantec. I wear a lot of different hats. I was hired on 5 years ago to drive ESG, sustainability, etc. But as has occurred in every facet of my life, I morph into lots of other things because I'm a technologist, an innovator, a business person because I'm a CPA, etc. So Stantec is a full service engineering EPCM company with 34,000 people across the globe. We've got 3,500 people in our mining group, and in Australia to US and 6 continents, and do the full mining value chain. So what would be the one thing that I wish more people understood? It's similar to what the other panelists have said. Decarbonization isn't just large initiatives like renewable energy or hydrogen trucks. It's everybody's responsibility. It requires a change in culture that acknowledges that decarbonization and meeting KPIs are not incongruous with each other. And in fact, many potential decarbonization initiatives can also improve operations.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And I suppose whilst I've got you, next question. So the whole premise of today's panel is that, the technology isn't the only barrier to, decarbonisation, even though I understand that, there's still gaps with technology. Do you agree that, there's more to the barriers holding back mining decarbonisation than just the technology? And I suppose what do you see as the primary barriers now to moving forward on that front? I'll start with yourself, Deborah.
Well, I think part of the problem is that the mining culture is feast or famine, and rocks over the line will always be the priority, regardless of whether we're in an up cycle or a down cycle. So scaled adoption of technology that decarbonizes has got to be implemented with non-disruptive disruption in a way that, it's not affecting the rocks over the line. The culture, therefore, needs to change to embrace validation projects that select the best available solutions and then configure them to their sites. Step change is a misnomer. Step change is built on incremental change. So I think the barrier, to sum it up, is that we're very driven by our KPIs, and this becomes a secondary thought process.
Oh, no, it's definitely reasonable when I suppose it's getting in the way of how we're doing things on a day-to-day basis. That sort of becomes too hard. Yeah, like Mick, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think everyone's offering today will be equally valuable, but I suppose my 2 cents is that there's not a consistent understanding and appreciation of the value proposition. So really, mining decarbonisation isn't just an ideology, but really an economic and a risk mitigation opportunity. We do see these again global trends of left-wing governments being installed and driving higher standards, driving different taxation and sort of royalties regimes, and hand in hand with that, decarbonisation is going to be a growing licence to operate concern. Some pockets of the industry really get that and are proactive. Pockets of the industry are anticipating this, and I suppose, yeah, there's just that inconsistency in terms of, hey, what is the value in terms of pursuing I suppose, a decarbonised mining future. So yeah, it's coming. I don't know how quickly, but yeah, we collectively we need to be on the front foot, and soon it'll be non-negotiable. I sort of liken the decarbonisation journey to safety. What may have been acceptable when I started in the industry certainly isn't acceptable today. And I anticipate there'll be that shift in terms of the emissions liabilities associated with how we operate. So it's coming. It's going to be of huge value. And yeah, to my mind, one of the barriers is sort of that inconsistent understanding of the just how big this is and how urgent it could become very quickly.
Okay. No, thank you. Back to yourself, Steph.
Yeah, I mean, like, so my job is to integrate decarb into active operations, right? I've been in climate change in the mining space for 15 years, and it really is, this is our time to shine, right? We've moved beyond compliance. We're getting to the pointy end. We're also seeing, approvals are really pushing this. So it's not just, you look at in Australia, we have Safeguard. That's not the only thing. It's, how do you make a mine approvable? I think one of the really big things there, like you can move beyond tech, right? Tech is not the be all and end all. There's a lot of things you can do right now. People think mining and they think, oh, well, we need like electric trucks. Now, electric trucks are not going to be the solution for everyone. They're a tech that you can use right now, because there's a really hard piece, and this is it. You don't want to do too many hard things at once. There's a really hard piece of integrating into an active operation, and that requires a huge management of change process. And so one of the biggest things that I see in my job is that you've got kind of tech providers that work in their little bubble. They might be, like working under their own regulations. They're often engineering focused. They're dictated by HAZOPs and all, cool stuff, right? And then you try and align that with the mining regulations. And, I'm in Queensland, I'll talk about coal mining regs, and that's a very risk-based process. When you're looking at all the different types of, our biggest thing here is fugitive emissions. So the oil and gas players come and they say, hey, we know what to do with gas. And it's that, when Debra's talking about what's incongruous, it's kind of regulation becomes the biggest thing, because you've got these two different regulations that are not meeting. So you can have tech that you're taking from different industries, you can have tech within, but if you're not going through a management of change process that is dictated by that site, because essentially this is about how do we safely integrate. This is not like, it could be any tech, it could be just a methodology change. We don't have to have something big and shiny going into a pit to make it a decarb thing. It could be a methodology change. But if you're not going through that MOC, then the SSE is not going to be able to sign off on that. Because at the end of the day, that SSE is accountable if you have implemented something which has added additional safety risk. So it is a bit like safety in that sense, but we're not here putting KPIs onto SSEs, right? Where, safety is one of the, if you look at a GM on site, they've got tons and safety. If you come in contact with any of those things, then your decarb process is dead. So I think the biggest barrier is actually how people are able to integrate that actual process. And until you understand how a mine site works, how it ticks, what are the, the nuances, even the differences. Like I'm going into one site now where they have completely different terminology to what seems like the whole rest of the industry. And it's kind of, you got to speak their language before you're going to be going into their pit.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I think that's, what you've been saying sort of feeds into the sort of next question, which, around that, organisation, the inertia and how things are done on site, and how, if it's active, deliberate active resistance, or if it's just sort of regulations and the processes in place for good reason, and how we move beyond that. And I suppose it's, part of, like you talk an example of the, just electrifying big trucks. It's like there's a lot in the mining industry of like just doing things how we do, but going from a diesel truck to an electric truck. Like, well, how much I want to frame the question, but how much to do with those sort of those inertia of how we've done things in the past, and other competing priorities. And I think you alluded to the regulation, but how do we, I suppose, change those sort of perceptions and those barriers to change?
Yeah, I mean, like it's a big, like, people talk about, oh, let's just get electric trucks. Like a haul truck is a bloody big thing. Like you want to electrify that. Like this is not a simple thing. This is like, you are literally changing how an open cut mine operates. The entire design philosophy, the mining process, the production philosophy. Like this is not just a simple thing. Not to mention that you can't buy them. So when people keep saying, oh, we'll decarb, like, we'll get there when the trucks are ready, like the trucks, if you have been actively working in developing that technology with the OEMs, let's say you can commercialize that tech by the end of this decade, you will get your orders fulfilled in the next decade. So if you have not been actively working with the OEMs, you're not getting a truck until the 2040s, right? So if you've got obligations to decarbonize your asset, do not expect electric trucks to do that. Like you need to think of something better. And in some cases, offsets are literally the only thing you can do, because if you've got the only emissions are diesel and you cannot get other fuel supplies, you cannot get, you have optimized the absolute crap out of your pit. There is no way that, except for getting something that doesn't exist yet, you can go on a wait list with CAT. I don't know how you do that. But, you think we have supply chain issues now with getting new assets, like you just wait. So it's nice to talk about electrifying big trucks and, having solar powered, backup for our diesel Jennies. Like when it comes to actually turning the dial between now and 2050, that's not it. It's not going to be it. So what other things do we need to be able to work on? And part of the work that I do is I review, provide independent peer review for approvals for 2 different governments or 2 different states. And one thing that they don't quite understand is that the onus cannot just be on the mines, because a mine is not going to develop a supply chain of renewable diesel. They're not going to develop a supply chain of our other alternative fuels. We can say, like, we have a big problem with diesel. We know how to deal with lots of other things. But until we actually have some active support in developing those supply chains, like it's cool if you're Rio Tinto and you can go and develop your own business unit of biodiesel that, can go to town and start actually, it's almost like an agricultural sector of Rio. But when it comes down to it, the vast majority of miners are not that. Like we do need help in those supply chains.
Yeah, Brett, if you don't mind, I'll jump in here. I suppose building on my opening comments in terms of the understanding of the value proposition, I suppose coming from a couple of different perspectives, one working in-house for a large mining company and now from a consulting perspective, I observe that, there is that misunderstanding of the value proposition, but everyone does see it as a long-term investment. And I suppose on the annual and the sub-annual sort of capital and funding allocation sort of processes that happen in the organisations, the long-term nature of I suppose the benefit and I suppose the value proposition will always be up against shorter-term priorities. And I suppose we have seen, and I will sort of point out the iron ore mining companies in WA, they all came out with very ambitious sort of spend profiles. And I suppose with the exception of Fortescue, they all quietly redacted their commitments. So that sort of reflects my comments in terms of that sort of misalignment in terms of the value proposition. So I also do observe value accretive investment proposals, and this is probably in Steph's space, coal seam gas to sort of energy projects that are NPV positive, have a clear emissions abatement value proposition, and despite being economic and favourable from an abatement perspective, really do struggle to get the capital allocation. And yes, I also sort of look at the technologies that are out there with Caterpillar, Komatsu. We've talked about battery trucks. I mean, Komatsu unveiled their battery electric truck at Mine Expo in 2021. And I'm not sure how their order book is looking. There is a Komatsu webinar next week I've dialed into, so have a look out for that one. But yeah, they're not getting flooded with orders for their products. So yeah, I suppose to step back and summarize, it is a long-term investment, and there is that sort of inconsistent appreciation of the value proposition, and yeah, do often get crowded out in the capital allocation processes on a real short-term basis.
No, thanks, Mick. A question that has come through from Danny: are tier one miners doing enough to de-risk electric haul truck development for OEMs through commitments, pilots, those sorts of things? Or are we stuck in a stalemate where miners are wait for a proven product? And yeah, as Steph was saying, that those timelines about getting access to those trucks get longer. Yeah,
but we are so appreciative to those tier one miners for putting in the effort. Like, if they weren't, BHP, Fortescue, Rio, if in the Australian context, if the Western Australian large players were not doing that, we would be so much further behind, I think, is the thing to think about. There's been, Mick, and you've been involved in a lot of this. There's been a lot of effort.
Yeah. And I suppose I slipped in my comment there about the Komatsu, I suppose, battery electric truck target at you, Danny. Nice to see you again, mate. And I'm aware that BHP took acceptance of their first battery truck yesterday. So yeah, things are happening, and yes, the tier one miners are doing their bit, but I was disappointed to see sort of funding commitments being withdrawn in the last couple of years by some of those big players.
I might jump in on that dynamic there, because it's an interesting one, and it shows, I guess, the competing and varying dynamics between surface and underground. Because underground, maybe to get to Mick's point, the value proposition was nice and clear with the potential for ventilation reduction, energy savings or capex savings that can offset the big capex spend on upfront electrical infrastructure and the vehicles themselves. So that obviously being a much harder and or a harder proposition to find in surface mining makes I think has gone a long way to show or drive the slowness of the change there. But I guess if we were talking about taking a step back and thinking about this technology change and the timelines of it, you know, for battery electric equipment especially, it's really not, that technology change has not really been driven within the mining industry. It's coming from these outside forces. You know, it wasn't the production volumes of vehicles for that have driven the increase in lithium-ion battery production have not come from mining and will never come from mining. So we have to be thinking about those kind of you know, outside of mining industry kind of forces and how they will impact on technology development and adaptation as it's brought into the mining sphere. So there's kind of that sort of technology learning curve that's happening outside of mining that's being pulled in. But then within mining itself, there's the learning curve for the users. Like I think Steph kind of got at it with that change management challenge, that you're talking about really fundamental changes to how a mining operation is engineered, planned, scheduled, maintained, all the logistics and everything outside of that. So there's a huge time requirement in just gaining that experience, upskilling and adjusting processes. And by definition, the bulk mines won't be those first adopters. The tier ones are sort of moving that direction, but it's a slow process. It's trials that lead to one or two machines. We're a long way away from scaling there. So just sort of having a realistic view of what the timelines have to be based on just the learning process and the scale of the change for that side of decarbonisation, I think is really important for people to wrap their heads around.
Debra?
Yeah, I heard a couple of themes there based on the original question about is it competing priorities, or is it that decarb is getting crowded out? And I think the three themes that I really heard is this waiting for the tier ones to do the big things. Well, I take exception to that because, as I said before, incremental change is what drives step change. So with regards to either fleet electrification in the surface, I agree with you, Edward, about the underground. It has a compelling financial impetus around the ventilation and so forth. And so what we need to find is more of the incremental change that can be done now in the smaller miners, and whether that's the fleets or whether that's your methane reduction. You're right, Steph, that the carbon credits, well, it's cheap to buy those and it's expensive to do these other technologies. Well, that doesn't really truly move the needle. Carbon credits, yes, that it fulfills the checkbox, but it doesn't move our industry. So the third thing that I heard then is that you know, our industry relies on commodity pricing, which rewards low-cost producers. Until we can get the end users to start paying, and then that to start flowing back to the mining industry, and that's a bigger issue than any of us on this call can solve, it's going to be a challenge. And I'll give you an example that I read, that the cost to go to green steel for all automobiles would be an amortized cost of $160. That's it. Now, if there was a mechanism for bringing that back to the miners who were trying to implement green steel, it would help fund the whole process. So we've got to be thinking, you know, these three different levels of incremental change, and how do we do it in a real way, and how do we change commodity pricing?
Like there, like Steph, did you have something?
Yeah, I picking up on that, like I only mentioned the credits as if you've done absolutely everything and there's no more that you can do with the tech that's available right now. I think one of the key things is, putting it in the framework of like, and I've heard value proposition a few times here, but this is about how do you put a value on the risk of not doing anything. And I think it's really difficult to be able to quantify that because our industry can only deal with risk in 2 dimensions, right? So we're really good at a risk matrix of, consequence and likelihood. And, that doesn't really look at a bunch of different things. When you're looking at decarb, most of it is an external dynamic risk. And that becomes more difficult. So, in the Australian context, we're dealing a lot with approvals, right? You'll deal with all sorts of different things. You'll deal with geopolitics in some regions. You'll think of, the access to workforce in others. There's all sorts of different things that come into a dynamic risk aspect of it, where you deal with communities and governments and whatnot. And these things are really hard to understand. And what we were doing a lot, if you go back 15 years ago, was to do with how do we maintain our social license. And when you start to look at, all the different types of things that actually lead to a miner losing, having an approval overturned, 20 years ago it was, or 15 years ago, it was, impacts to community. Right now, what we're seeing as, objections to approvals is all to do with climate change, right? We're seeing this massive uptick of, international players coming through, local community groups and putting in objections. Now, it's a really effective approach. I have no comment of, if they want to do it or not, go for gold. But the thing is that nobody is actually looking at how those types of small, tiny pieces of risk, how they interact with each other and they can grow. Now, we had an example of that when I was back in the day working on site at Mount Thorley Warkworth, and we had a community basically shut down Rio Tinto Coal Australia. Now, essentially what happened was there was this growing community aspect, social license was lost, then we couldn't develop more mines through the valley, which then meant that, it became, they lost the things that, they were no longer long life assets with, expansion, the things that make an asset worth continuing to invest. Now, that lost that huge amount just because there were decisions made of how to operate that mine. Now, if you looked at as a dynamic risk in terms of tiny little things that can turn your social license over and essentially shut down a mine, then you can start to think about what's the value of that. And if you're looking at the value proposition of going and actually doing, a pilot, doing a trial, starting to, implement some of these different technologies or methodologies on a site for decarb, which is the thing that's coming up now, is the thing which is getting everyone locked in land court in Queensland, or approvals overturned, or not even getting through in the New South Wales context. Not sure what's happening on the West Coast or in the rest of the world, but that's what's happening here. And it's all based on climate. Now, if you can actually demonstrate that you're doing something and that is what will get your mine approved, then all of a sudden you've linked that value of that operating and continuously expanding asset to that action that you're doing in a commitment to reduce the emissions. And that starts to change the dial on that value proposition, because it's no longer a straight NPV over emissions abated, right? Which is how we do everything through MAC curves. You're starting to then look at what's the dynamic risk of inaction versus doing something, and that can really start to change that dial.
I suppose, and that's a hard one to measure or quantify, the cost of it, of inaction. There was a comment early on, I think, from Ben around, there not being, in WA iron ore, for example, not being enough electricians, let alone, moving to all electric. So, question around, where the, most the critical sort of skills gaps, at the operator or engineering leadership. I suppose I had that down sort of for you, Ed, but I'm sure most of you probably have, points on that, because I suppose about those critical skills, it's hard to transition, anything. So Ed, do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think the sort of skills shortage is maybe at all levels, but yeah, finding electricians is definitely a challenge. There's kind of competition, and what there often ends up, or my experience is really talking from for underground, and there's competition amongst OEMs and the miners for the same kind of pools of talent. So there's different strategies an organization can take to deal with that issue. One example, mine we worked with in BC. They kind of started with the battery as a service approach, where they essentially are relying on the OEMs to provide them with the kind of maintenance support and service technicians that can deal with both the heavy duty mechanic side as well as the electrician BEV electrician side of things. But they had a bigger strategy to ultimately bring that capacity in-house. So they're finding individuals within their organization with a keen interest in the technology. They have them shadow the batteries as a service technicians. They're developing that skill set. They even invested in some additional training to get technicians kind of dual ticketed for mechanic and electrician skill sets, all with the goal to bring that capacity into the organization. And not be as fully reliant on the OEMs. Now, there's other reasons battery as a service is a commercial arrangement that kind of can de-risk and improve the financial picture of battery electric vehicles. But from that skills perspective, you can, if the OEMs are offering it, and in underground most of them are with the battery as a service approach, you can use that as at least a stepping stone to kind of fill that skills gap. You can still run into challenges if you're in areas that are maybe geographically not well kind of supported by all the OEMs or the dealers, where that workforce might not even exist, might have to be flown in. So there's costs that can be associated with it, but definitely, the workers on the ground, you just don't have that level of experience because the technology's not been out there. So you're going to have to address the kind of longer term problem by investing in developing that in-house and making that part of your change management process.
Definitely, and I suppose part of those gaps in skills, but I suppose it's also the people that understand decarb outside of the standard day-to-day pressures of getting tons up the shaft or whatever it is. Having that skills and knowledge on site to be able to lead that. Did anyone else have any thoughts around some of those skills gaps, or I suppose knowledge gaps on the mining operations?
Yeah, I read a paper when I was sort of trying to tackle or frame the way forward for this in a previous role, and the government in Australia published a paper at a macro level, talking about the skills mix required for essentially a new energy transition sort of pathway in Australia. So it's not just limited to the mining sector in terms of the new skill requirements to sort of operate in that sort of energy transition future. But more broadly, it's going to be a challenge for all sectors, not just from a mining perspective, and this will be a global trend. So I suppose key takeaway, push your kids, your neighbours, your friends towards electrical sort of careers, and then they'll be set for success.
Yeah, I think sort of going back to what Steph said not long ago on quantifying the the benefits or the the price of not doing anything. I think one of our first question from James was around yeah, the decarb can increase resilience of mine operations. Like how do you quantify that value created through that risk reduction? Like I suppose Steph was saying,
It's hard.
how do you do that?
It's really hard. And thinking about skill sets, like one of the big things is that if you've got those exciting projects occurring, that's a key retention strategy as well. Hiring and retention for skill sets. If you're working in more of a, what the market is seeing is as future facing, by implementing decarbonisation strategies and being an early mover. I know, like in terms of that quantification, when I worked at KPMG, there was a big program there on dynamic risk assessment, and it's more at the enterprise level, which it's a fascinating process, and there's a lot of really smart people who have developed that approach to be able to identify, and quantify what are the key things that can kill your business and how do you cover that. But getting that down to an operational level is quite difficult. And so I think one of the key things is if you're doing that type of risk assessment approach is that you actually need to rely on a lot of expert elicitation to be able to understand the nuance of individual operations and what will occur if you get risk clusters together. So, I mean, you can even do it through that value, by using a traditional risk matrix. If you can develop scenarios of risk clusters, A happens, which causes B, and then together those things become, a single event. So, if it's, we haven't moved on decarb, which means that we're getting a bunch of submissions in and now we're being taken through land court. You can quantify then what is the impact of having to go through land court. You've all of a sudden got 12 months delay in your production, and there's a huge number of ways that you can start to scenario base the risk and put that through a traditional risk mitigation or risk management framework. But one of the key things that we're seeing is that people are starting to understand the risk by seeing what's occurring in Queensland and New South Wales are quite highly regulated when it comes to emissions reduction. We're required to put in greenhouse gas abatement strategies in with approvals, and they're becoming more and more strict in the way of what they're pushing through. If it's not up to muster, they're going to push it back. Which happened in the valley. One of the miners down there said, not good enough, go back and do it again, before it even went through the submission process. But we're now getting miners come to us and say, can we start work on a project because we have approvals coming up in a few years? And the cost of doing a project, let's say it's $10 million, is going to be less than the cost that they can see of not getting that mine extended. So I think they're starting to see the connection in what that is. Unfortunately, it's meant that some other people have had to exemplify the cost of what that is. But I think, when it comes to being able to allocate a cost, it's not easy, and you require the people who understand that operation the best.
Any other thoughts around that?
Just briefly on
Sorry?
quantification, because total cost of ownership for the electric vehicle adoption kind of sphere is a framework that gets talked about a lot, and it requires a bit of a shift in mindset, where you're really trying to get a full picture, or trying to forecast a full picture for what that breakdown of capital and operating costs are, and especially when you're looking at different scenarios of charging and electrical infrastructure capacity to give you the production capacity that you're looking for. And I guess there's the old saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I am a believer in modeling as an exercise, and kind of see that as a part of the process for continuously, or providing the framework for that continuous updating of information and knowledge of the problem as more data becomes available and as technology matures, or you actually get to see those electric trucks that are going through the early learner programs and all now. They're still prototype systems. What they actually look like in real life when they eventually kind of reach maturity is not going to be what they are now. So you need to be have a framework for constantly assessing the your forecast for what the cost and performance are going to look like, especially with this newer technologies.
Okay. I just had a question coming from Danny, which was on the same theme, and I was going to ask a question myself. So it's asked, what cost elements are still underestimated in total cost of ownership models, charging infrastructure, downtime, skills, grid upgrades, and the like? That was tying with a question I had around, what are the costs, financial, commercial, things that we're underestimating in our models.
I'm happy to tackle this one, Brett, and I suppose we touched on a couple of times the value proposition and the value of a project or a mining project getting approved or delayed. Say it's $1 billion NPV project. If you can avoid taking that through court for 3 years, that's 300 million of that $1 billion NPV. So demonstrable progress, and from an emissions abatement perspective, and that's where I talked about the value proposition. It's not just you need to buy this sort of technology and then you get this carbon abatement, and then carbon credits are currently $20 a ton. But in terms of the cost, I see a mine as an ecosystem, and the commodity, the mining method, open cut underground, strip mining, terrace mining, deep porphyry copper mines, they're all going to have different solutions. And whilst we know the cost of battery electric trucks, or have a view on that, and we know how much power lines cost, and we know how much sort of gas wells cost, the nuances or that sort of integrated ecosystem where you take out this diesel type equipment and you put in a different sort of solution, I think we're underestimating the complexity of what that new ecosystem is going to look like. And I'm sort of keeping an eye on some of the comments that are coming through on my other screen, and yes, the change is real. The change is significant, and whilst we know the unit cost of all the things we need to throw at these sort of new mines of the future, they are going to look very different, and it really validates the importance of trials, and whether that's in fugitives abatement, whether that's in diesel abatement, new mining methods, really underscores the value of doing these trials, of partnering early, starting your journey early. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and that's the solution for any particular mine. Doesn't have that sort of executable level of granularity just yet. So yeah, hopefully, shed some light. What are we underestimating? But yeah, the complexity or the nuances of these new ecosystems.
Okay. Deborah? Oops, sorry, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I agree with you that the social license to operate is, and the cost of not having that is absolutely underestimated. And I've done talks on and listed out all the mines that have put in hundreds of millions of dollars, and walking away from that is just ridiculous. The second item, though, I'll take exception to, and that is that we need to do more pilots, because 70% of pilots fail, and they don't fail. They fail to move to scaled adoption. And so the cost that's underestimated is the cost of a failed pilot. And the reason they're failing is not because the technology wasn't good. The technology was just fine, typically. You didn't go into that much of an expense to pick a bad technology. What's more likely happening is that the pilot was not structured in a way to make it succeed. Most pilots are done as binary, yes, no. Okay, well, if we did that with our children, they'd never turn up to be adults. And the same is true of technologies. Is, you know, it's neither good nor bad. You need to change the process to be validation to scale or proof of value. And how are we going to scale it? So you've gone through this process, you've identified the problem. Maybe it needs multiple solutions. So doing linear pilots isn't going to get you there faster. And they don't put their absolute best person on those pilots typically, because the best person is over here doing production. And so, you know, this fail fast mindset of pilots is actually, how quickly can we kick this one to the curb? And that hurts the culture. It's wasted money. And so to me, that's one of the bigger costs.
Yeah, definitely. You see, at least down in Australia, lots of, like you say, trials, and how many actually move to a bigger, full implementation is, not so much there. Yeah, well, I think we're getting close to time, so I'm sure we could talk for hours longer, but probably need to wrap things up. But I'll just, I suppose, ask sort of a final question from everyone of what around, like, if you could change one thing around policy, culture, process, funding, what have you, what for the biggest, like, impact on mining decarb, what would that be? What would be the big thing that you choose? I might as well start with yourself, Deborah.
The one thing I would change, as I referred to, is this fact that commodity pricing doesn't reward those that are doing it better. But we can't impact that. So let me take it to a personal level. If you want to make one change in your organization, find the intersectionality of site issues, stakeholder priorities, cost reduction or increased production, and decarbonization. If you find that intersectionality, you're going to find a solution, or you're going to find an opportunity to really make an impact.
Okay, thank you. Steph?
Yeah, I think, like, the main thing I would probably finish with is that don't try too many new things at once. When you start trying too many new things at once, then you've got too many, I guess, variables that can fail. Try, an existing technology with a new approach, even integrating into active operations. That is a new thing, right? So try that with an existing technology first. When we're trying too many things at once, then you just it's ripe for failure, and we saw that in the green hydrogen sector, unfortunately.
Mick?
For me, it's really about, hey, you've got to start somewhere, and it doesn't need to be big bang, but really it's about challenging. Are you doing enough? as an organisation. And really there will be consequences of delay in this space. So really, yeah, start somewhere and plug for my firm. Reach out if you need some help.
No worries. Thanks, Nick. Finish yourself, Ed.
Right, I'll wrap it up quick. If I could change one thing, and I had a magic wand, I guess it would be to see the OEMs kind of taking full advantage of the drop in costs in lithium-ion batteries technology outside of mining, and change a little bit the development paradigm away from the kind of deep integration they're taking it. There's not cost savings coming from that. But I guess on a more realistic or a smaller scale, I'd like to see, the attendees here today take away just or walk away from this this talk with the idea of having a conversation with people in their team, people up and down the organization, gauge the interest that's out there, and hopefully those conversations can get the ball rolling about not just BEVs but all aspects of decarbonisation and where those opportunities are.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. Yeah, so wrap things up there, but thanks to our 4 panelists and everyone else that's tuned in. Us, like Steph just said, we in our chat we didn't get to everyone's questions, but there's a lot of conversations going on in the chat there. So thanks everyone for asking those questions and being engaged. So yeah, we'll end things there. But thank you everyone for tuning in, and yeah, stay tuned for the next webinar we'll have coming up soon. Thank you.
And thank you, Brett, for your ongoing efforts in this space. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everyone.